Please don't drink anything your fiancé gives you tonight.
The ballroom was breathtaking, crystal chandeliers casting golden light across 200 of the city's most powerful people. Champagne flowing, laughter echoing. And at the center of it all, Raymond Holt, standing tall in his tailored black tuxedo, looking, for the first time in 4 years, like a man who had finally found his way back to happiness. His fiancée, Vivienne, stood beside him in an ivory gown that made every woman in the room quietly envious. She was laughing at something a senator's wife had said. Her hand rested gently on Raymond's arm, warm, possessive, perfect. And Raymond, brilliant, guarded, privately broken Raymond, looked at her like she had personally pulled him out of the darkest chapter of his life. Because as far as he was concerned, she had. This was the Holt Foundation's annual charity gala. Raymond had hosted it every year for the past 11 years. It was the event his late wife, Margaret, had started from nothing. A small fundraiser in a hotel conference room that had grown into the city's most anticipated evening of the year. Margaret had loved this night. She had believed deeply and completely that people with power had an obligation to use it gently. Raymond had kept the gala running after her death, not because it was good for business, though it was, but because standing in this room every year was the closest he could still get to her. Tonight should have been a celebration. He was engaged, he was healthy, he was ready, and, "Sir," Raymond turned, standing near the ballroom entrance. Just inside the gilded double doors was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. She was wearing a simple navy dress, clearly not the gown of someone who belonged at a $2,000 a plate charity dinner. She had wide, serious eyes. The kind of eyes that didn't belong on a child. The kind that had seen something they were never supposed to see. She was shaking. Just slightly, the way people shake when they've been rehearsing something terrifying for a very long time and have finally forced themselves to do it. Raymond looked around briefly, confused, half expecting to see a parent rushing over to retrieve her. Nobody came. He crouched down to her level. "Hey," he said softly. "Are you lost, sweetheart? Who are you here with?" The girl didn't answer that question. Instead, she leaned forward, and she whispered, so quietly that Raymond would spend the next 3 days wondering if he had imagined it. "Please don't drink anything your fiancé gives you tonight." Raymond froze. The laughter of the room continued around him. The champagne kept flowing, the orchestra kept playing. But Raymond Holt was completely, utterly still. He opened his mouth to respond, to ask her name, to ask her why, to ask her anything, but when he looked up, she was gone. Vanished into the crowd as quietly as she had appeared. For a moment, Raymond stood there alone in the noise and light of the most glamorous room in the city. His heart was beating strangely. His mind told him it meant nothing. A child. A confused child who had wandered in from somewhere. A prank, maybe. Nothing. He straightened his jacket. He walked back toward the center of the room. He smiled at a colleague who raised a glass in his direction, and then Vivienne appeared at his elbow, glowing, graceful, holding 2 fresh glasses of champagne. "There you are," she said, pressing one gently into his hand. "I've been looking everywhere for you. The Alderton group wants to say hello." She smiled at him, that beautiful, practiced, luminous smile, and Raymond looked down at the glass in his hand. The sham caught the chandelier light, golden, sparkling, perfect. His fingers tightened around the stem, and for the first time all evening, his hands began to shake. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what was happening to Raymond Holt, you need to understand what he had survived before Vivienne ever walked into his life. Because Raymond was not a man who trusted easily. He was not a man who opened doors without checking what was behind them first. He had built his wealth, a real estate and private equity portfolio valued at just over $3 billion, through 4 decades of careful, deliberate, almost surgical decision-making. He trusted numbers, he trusted history, he trusted patterns. People were harder. People had always been harder. Raymond had grown up in a modest household in Virginia, the son of a high school mathematics teacher and a seamstress who worked nights to help pay the mortgage. He had earned his first real money at 26 through a property deal that everyone around him told him would fail. It hadn't. He had earned his second and third and fourth through the same quiet stubbornness. a refusal to be moved by opinion, by fear, or by pressure. By the time he was 40, Raymond Holt was a man that cities courted and politicians called. But the greatest thing that had ever happened to him had nothing to do with money. Her name was Margaret. Margaret Louise Holt, née Crawford, had been Raymond's wife for 22 years. She was a pediatric surgeon. Brilliant, sharp, and entirely unimpressed by wealth, which was, Raymond always said, exactly what had made him fall completely in love with her the first time they met at a medical fundraiser when he was 32. "You're in real estate," she had said, not looking particularly interested. "I am," he had replied. "Do people actually need more luxury condominiums?" He had laughed, genuinely surprised, for the first time in what felt like months. They were engaged 14 months later. For 2 decades, Margaret was the architecture beneath everything Raymond built. She kept him honest. She kept him grounded. She gave him 2 children, a son named Daniel, now 31 and living in London, and a daughter named Claire, 28, who worked in non-profit fundraising and called her father every Sunday morning without fail. And then, without any warning that felt adequate, Margaret was gone. She had been experiencing fatigue for several months. Her own colleagues had attributed it to overwork. She was a surgeon who regularly pulled 70-hour weeks. And she was also, quietly and without complaint, managing the early stages of what turned out to be an autoimmune condition. She had not wanted Raymond to worry. She had been, in this one way, wrong to protect him. Because by the time the full picture became clear, by the time the fatigue and the other symptoms were properly investigated, the damage to her system was already severe. Margaret Holt died on a Thursday morning in October. She was 61 years old. Raymond had held her hand. He had not left the hospital in 4 days. He had been, there is no softer way to say this, completely destroyed. For 2 years after her death, Raymond was a ghost inside his own life. He attended meetings. He signed documents. He showed up. But anyone who had known him before could see, clearly, painfully, that something essential was missing. His daughter Claire flew home twice that first year just to sit with him. His son Daniel called every few days with the strained cheerfulness of a man trying to hold something together from across an ocean. Raymond told them both he was fine. He was not fine. He met Vivienne Carver at a private investment dinner approximately 27 months after Margaret's death. She was 39 to his 64. She was stunning in the way that made people briefly forget what they were saying. Dark hair, sharp eyes, a laugh that arrived like she was giving you a gift. She worked, she said, in philanthropic consulting, helping high-net-worth individuals strategize their charitable giving, which sounded impressive, which was meant to sound impressive. Raymond had not been looking for anyone. He had told Claire, more than once, that he was not interested in companionship. That part of his life, he had said quietly, belonged to Margaret. But Vivienne was patient in a way that felt at the time like gentleness. She did not pursue him, she was simply present. At the same gallery opening 3 weeks later, at a mutual friend's dinner, at a conference he had almost canceled. She always seemed faintly surprised to see him, pleasantly so, as if their meetings were the universe's idea and not hers. Raymond, who had spent 40 years reading rooms and people, who had built a career on knowing when something was structured to look like coincidence, did not question it. He told himself later that grief does something to a person's instincts, blunts them, fills the space where suspicion usually lives with something that just wants, desperately, to feel warmth again. By the time he understood what had been happening, he would wish, more than anything, that he had trusted his instincts that very first evening. Their courtship, as Raymond described it to Claire, was quiet. Vivienne cooked for him. She asked careful, interested questions about Margaret. Not in a way that felt invasive, but in a way that felt respectful. Like she understood that loving Raymond meant making room for Margaret too. She attended his foundation meetings. She offered thoughtful suggestions about the gala programming. She got along warmly with his household staff, his housekeeper Constance, his driver George, his personal assistant Miles. She sent Claire a handwritten note after their first dinner together, saying how much she admired the work Claire did and how clear it was that she had been raised by extraordinary parents. Claire had called Raymond the next morning and said carefully, "Dad, she seems really lovely." Raymond had said, "She is, But there were things, small things, the kind that are easy to explain away when you want to, that didn't quite sit flush. Vivian had begun, gradually and warmly, to manage Raymond's medications. He took 3. A blood pressure medication, a mild sleep supplement his cardiologist had recommended, and a daily vitamin protocol his doctor had put together after Margaret's death, when Raymond had stopped eating properly for months. Vivian took over this quietly. "You always forget," she said with the affectionate exasperation of someone who loves you. "Let me do this. It's not a big deal." And it wasn't, was it? It was kind. It was caring. That's what it looked like. She also, Raymond noticed in retrospect, managed his morning schedule with increasing authority. If someone called during breakfast, his doctor, his attorney, his children, she would answer, take a message, assure them Raymond would call back. She was protective of his time, she said. And when conversations turned to Margaret, especially with old friends who had known her well, Vivienne had a way of redirecting things. Not rudely, never rudely, just a gentle pivot, a new subject, a question asked at precisely the right moment to pull the room somewhere else. Raymond had noticed it once and mentioned it, gently, at home, privately. Vivienne had looked at him with something that might have been hurt. "I just don't want people making you sad," she said quietly. "I know how much you miss her. I'm trying to protect you." Raymond had apologized. He had told himself he was being uncharitable, and then, because he wanted to believe she was exactly what she appeared to be, he had let it go. At the gala, Raymond stood beside Vivienne for the next hour with the champagne glass in his hand. He smiled. He shook hands. He made the rounds, and he never drank a single sip. When no one was looking, he set the glass on the tray of a passing waiter and watched it disappear into the crowd. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself he was being paranoid. He went home that night beside Vivienne, who kissed him on the cheek before she fell asleep, and told him the gala had been perfect. And Raymond lay in the dark for 3 hours, staring at the ceiling, thinking about a little girl with serious eyes, and what she had known that he didn't. Raymond did not sleep that night. He told himself it was nothing more than the overstimulation of the gala. 200 conversations, a long speech, the emotional weight of being in that room again, Margaret's room, without Margaret. He told himself a child had said something strange, and strange things happen at crowded events, and it meant nothing. He told himself this several times. Each time it helped a little less. By morning, he felt it. A dull pressure behind his eyes that wasn't quite a headache. A slowness in his thinking, as if his thoughts had to travel slightly farther than usual to arrive where he needed them. He had felt this before, once, twice, over the past several weeks. He had mentioned it to his doctor at his last appointment. His doctor had said what doctors say when a 64-year-old man reports mild cognitive fog and fatigue. Stress, sleep, hydration. At your age, Raymond, slow down a little. Raymond had accepted this. He was not a man who enjoyed being told to slow down, but he was also not a man who ignored medical advice when it came directly. So he had slowed down, and the fog had not lifted. It was Constance, his housekeeper of 19 years, who first said something, though she said it carefully in the way that loyal staff learn to speak when they are worried about something they cannot fully name. "Mr. Holt," she said one morning, appearing in the doorway of his study, with a look that was trying very hard to be neutral. "Are you feeling all right?" Raymond looked up from the documents on his desk. Documents he had been reading, he realized, for nearly 40 minutes without absorbing a word of them. "Fine," he said. Constance was quiet for a moment. "You left the stove on last night," she said carefully, after Miss Vivian went up. Raymond looked at her. "I heated some milk," he said. "I went back and turned it off." Constance looked at him with an expression that was very gentle and very concerned. "You didn't, sir," she said. "I found it on at 6 this morning." Raymond stared at her. The silence in the room was heavy. "I must have forgotten," he said finally. "Thank you for catching it, Constance." Constance nodded once and left. But she turned back at the doorway, just for a moment, and the look on her face was not one Raymond would easily forget. It was the look of someone watching something happen that they don't know how to stop. The symptoms escalated slowly. Not dramatically, not in the way you see in films, where someone collapses suddenly and the music swells. It was quieter than that, more insidious. More frightening, actually, because of how easy it was to dismiss. There was the dizziness, brief, occurring usually in the late morning, gone before it could be properly examined. There was the fatigue, deep and strange, arriving not at the end of a long day, as fatigue should, but mid-morning without reason. There was the loss of appetite. He found himself pushing food around plates he would normally have cleared. And there was the memory. Small things at first. A meeting he had scheduled that he couldn't recall afterward. A phone call with Daniel during which he lost his train of thought so completely that Daniel had said, quietly and with poorly concealed alarm, "Dad, are you still there?" A conversation with his attorney, a man named Frank Ossie he had worked with for 20 years, during which he had signed 2 documents he realized later he hadn't properly read. When he asked Miles, his assistant, to retrieve those documents for review, Miles came back looking uncomfortable. "Miss Vivian said she filed them, sir," he said. "She said you'd asked her to handle the follow-up." Raymond had no memory of asking her that. None at all. He noticed something else during this period, something that he would only fully understand later, once all the pieces were in place. His symptoms were not constant. There were days, usually when Vivienne was traveling for work, when he felt almost entirely like himself. Clear, sharp, energized. He would power through meetings. He would call his children. He would review his documents with the focused attention that had built everything he owned. And then she would return, always warmly, always with groceries or a prepared meal or a particular herbal tea she had read was good for sleep. And within a day or two, the fog would settle back in. Raymond noticed this. He filed it somewhere in his mind. He did not yet know what to do with it. He went back to his doctor. He sat in the clean white office of Dr. Elliot Barnes, his physician of 16 years, and described as precisely as he could what he had been experiencing. Elliot listened carefully. He ordered blood work. He performed cognitive assessments. He looked, with the measured concern of a good doctor, at a man who had been under enormous emotional stress for over 2 years, who had recently committed to a new relationship, who was 64 years old and running a $3 billion empire. The blood work came back largely unremarkable. Elliot sat down across from him. "Raymond," he said, "you lost Margaret 2.5 years ago. You've barely slowed down since. Your body, your mind eventually sends you a bill for that." He suggested rest. He suggested therapy again. He adjusted the dosage on one of Raymond's medications slightly. Raymond sat in the parking lot of the medical building for a long time after the appointment. He thought about what the doctor had said. He thought about the little girl. He thought about the days when Vivienne was away, and he felt almost entirely like himself. And then he did something he had not done in a very long time. He picked up his phone, and he called Frank Ossie. "Frank," he said carefully, "those 2 documents I signed last month, I want to go through them again, personally. Bring them to my office tomorrow. Just you and me." There was a short pause on the other end of the line. "Of course, Raymond," Frank said. His tone was careful, measured, the tone of a man who had been waiting for this phone call. Raymond sat in his car for a moment longer. The autumn light was fading. The street outside the medical building was quiet. And somewhere in the city, in a house Raymond didn't know yet, with a woman he hadn't met yet, a retired hospice nurse named Edith Owusu was watching the evening news and thinking about Raymond Holt, and deciding finally that she had stayed quiet long enough. Her name was Amara. She was 8 years old. She was small for her age, the kind of small that made adults underestimate her, with deep brown eyes that processed the world around her, with a watchfulness that didn't quite match her years. She lived with her grandmother, Edith Owusu, in a quiet row house on the east side of the city. Edith was 67, retired, a former hospice and palliative care nurse with 31 years of experience in some of the city's most demanding medical environments. She was a woman who had spent 3 decades sitting with people at the end of things. She had held more hands than she could count. She had watched more goodbyes than most people could imagine. And she had learned, through years of quiet, careful observation, to recognize when something wasn't right. Edith had been one of the nurses assigned to Margaret Holt during the final weeks of her illness. She had not been assigned to the case from the beginning. She had come in during the last rotation, when Margaret's condition had declined rapidly and the medical team was managing comfort rather than cure. Edith had liked Margaret immediately. This was not unusual. Edith liked most of her patients, or at least found ways to see them completely, to understand who they were beyond the illness that had brought them to her. But Margaret was different. Margaret was sharp, even in those final weeks. Funny, disarmingly honest, and underneath all of that, frightened. Not of dying exactly. Margaret Holt was a surgeon. She understood death, perhaps better than most. She was frightened of something she couldn't quite name. Something she kept almost saying and then pulling back from. One night, it was late, and the floor was quiet, and Edith had come in to check vitals and adjust Margaret's positioning. Margaret had reached out and taken her wrist. "Something is wrong," Margaret had said quietly. Edith had been professionally gentle. "Mrs. Holt, with your current levels." No, Margaret's grip was surprisingly firm for someone so depleted. "Something is wrong that isn't medical, or isn't only medical." She had looked at Edith with eyes that were absolutely clear. "I'm a doctor," she said. "I know what my body feels like. And something in the past few weeks has felt off, separate from the diagnosis." Something. She had stopped. She had looked toward the door, and she had let go of Edith's wrist. "Never mind. I'm sorry. I'm probably confused." Edith had noted it. She had filed it in her mind the way a good nurse files everything, quietly, carefully, to be returned to later. She had mentioned it to the attending physician. Briefly, gently, the way nurses learn to mention things to doctors who may not want to hear them. The attending had nodded in the way that meant, "This is grief speaking, this is fear, this is a very sick woman whose mind is tired." Edith had let it go. She had stayed with Margaret through those final days. She had held her hand on the Thursday morning when Raymond was on one side and she was on the other, and Margaret Holt had left quietly, without drama, like someone who had finally decided the argument wasn't worth continuing. Edith had gone home that evening. She had sat in her kitchen. She had thought about what Margaret had said. Something is wrong that isn't only medical, and she had, God help her, let it go. She had told herself it was the illness talking. She had told herself that Margaret had been frightened and exhausted, and that frightened, exhausted people say things that don't always mean what they sound like. She had gone back to her other patients. She had retired 14 months later. She had thought about Margaret Holt often, and she had, in her own private way, never fully forgiven herself for letting it go. It was Amara who had changed everything. Amara, who spent her after-school hours at her grandmother's house while her mother worked. Amara, who was quiet and watchful and who had, without quite understanding why, absorbed much of her grandmother's observational precision. It had started innocuously enough. Edith had been watching a local news segment, one of those soft pieces about charitable giving, that featured the Holt Foundation and, briefly, Raymond Holt. Standing beside him in the footage was a woman, his fiancée. Edith had gone very still. "Grandma," Amara had said, "what's wrong?" Edith had not answered immediately, because she recognized the woman on the screen. Not well, not from a close relationship, but from a hospital corridor, years ago, near the end of Margaret Holt's illness, where Edith had seen this woman once, lingering, in the way that people who don't belong somewhere linger when they're trying to look like they do. She had been speaking quietly to someone on a phone. She had glanced up and met Edith's eyes, and then she had turned and walked quickly away. Edith had not thought about it again, until now. Until she was sitting in her kitchen watching a news segment about a dying woman's husband, who had apparently found love again with a woman whose face Edith was almost certain she had seen in the hospital where Margaret Holt had spent her final weeks. "Grandma," Amara had said again. "Who is that lady?" Edith had taken a breath. "No one you need to worry about," she had said carefully. But Amara was 8 years old and she had her grandmother's eyes, the kind that noticed everything and forgot nothing. She had looked at the woman on the screen, and she had looked at her grandmother's face, and she had understood that whatever her grandmother was feeling about that woman, it was not nothing. What happened next required courage that Edith would later say she almost didn't find. She made calls, quietly, carefully, to former colleagues, to a nurse who had worked the floor during Margaret's last admission. She wasn't looking for anything specific. She told herself she wasn't. But what she found, slowly, pieced together from half-remembered details, and one very long phone call with a colleague named Patricia, who had always had a sharper memory than anyone Edith had ever worked with, was this. During the final 2 weeks of Margaret Holt's admission, there had been a woman, a visitor, who had come to the floor on at least 2 occasions. She had not been on any approved visitor list. She had claimed, both times, to be a colleague of Margaret's from the hospital where Margaret had previously worked. The floor staff had been busy. It was the kind of ward where people were not always monitored as carefully as they might have been on a busier floor. The woman had not stayed long. She had not been seen entering Margaret's room, but she had been seen near the medication station on one of those visits. Patricia remembered because she had thought it was odd and had meant to mention it. And then the day had gotten away from her, the way days do, and she hadn't. And now Margaret Holt had been dead for 2.5 years. And the woman Patricia described, calm, well-dressed, dark-haired, with an easy manner and a smile that came a fraction of a second too slow, was, as far as Edith could determine, the same woman currently wearing an engagement ring on Raymond Holt's arm. Edith sat with this for 2 days. 2 days of sitting at her kitchen table. 2 days of Amara watching her grandmother's face, and knowing, the way children know these things, that something serious was happening inside an adult they loved. On the 3rd day, Edith had told Amara, not everything but enough. There is a man, she had said carefully, who might be in danger, and I'm not sure what to do about it. Amara had looked at her grandmother for a long moment. Then you have to warn him, she had said simply, as if it were that easy, as if courage were simply a matter of deciding to use it. I don't know how to get near him, Edith said quietly. Men like Raymond Holt, they have people, layers. The gala, Amara said. Edith looked at her. The lady on the news said his foundation was having a gala, Amara said. The Holt Foundation Gala. She said it was at the Meridian Hotel. She said next Saturday. Edith had stared at her granddaughter, 8 years old, watching the news, filing the details. You can't go to something like that, Edith said. I can, Amara said. Her voice was very quiet, very certain. My friend Sophie's mom works at the Meridian, she said, in the kitchen. She takes me sometimes after school when she finishes late. I know where all the doors are. Edith had looked at her granddaughter for a long time. She had thought about Margaret Holt saying something is wrong. She had thought about staying quiet once before. And she had said, God help her. All right. But Amara, she said, you listen to me carefully. You find him. You say what we practiced, and then you leave. You don't argue. You don't explain. You say it and you go. Do you understand? Amara had nodded. And if anyone tries to stop you or question you, I go straight to Sophie's mom, Amara said. I know. Edith had cupped her granddaughter's face in both hands. And for a moment, she hadn't been able to speak at all. Because she was looking at a child who had somehow, in 8 years of living, accumulated enough courage and enough love and enough quiet intelligence to walk into a room full of 200 powerful people and whisper the truth to the one person who needed to hear it. Please don't drink anything your fiancé gives you tonight. The night after the gala, Edith received a text from a number she didn't recognize. It said only, I heard her. I'm listening. Can we meet? She stared at it for a long time. And then she typed back, yes, tell me where. Raymond Holt was not a man who met with strangers easily. He had a team, security, legal communications, whose entire professional purpose was to manage who got access to him and under what circumstances. But something had shifted inside him in the days following the gala. The fog in his thinking, always worse after meals Vivian prepared, almost entirely absent when she traveled, had reached a level he could no longer dismiss. He had not drunk the champagne. He had been careful, quietly and without drawing attention, about what else he consumed in his own home. Within 4 days, 4 days of careful management, his thinking was sharper than it had been in months. The difference was terrifying, because it meant the fog had not been his grief. It had not been his age. It had not been stress. It meant something was causing it. And he was becoming increasingly, devastatingly certain of what and who that something was. He met Edith Owusu at Frank Osie's office on a Wednesday morning. He brought Frank. He did not tell Vivian where he was going. He had told her he had back-to-back calls. He had watched her face, the slight practiced adjustment of her expression, and understood, in the way that you understand things once you have stopped trying not to, that she was calculating something. She was always calculating something. The meeting with Edith lasted 2 hours. Raymond sat very still for most of it. He was a man who had made a career of listening to information and processing it, without allowing his face to broadcast his interior state. He was grateful for that skill now, because what Edith told him, quietly, precisely, with the measured delivery of someone who had spent 30 years speaking carefully in rooms where what you said mattered enormously, was the most frightening thing anyone had ever said to him. Not because it was impossible, because it was entirely, completely plausible. After Edith finished speaking, Raymond sat in silence for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "My wife said something." Edith looked at him. "In the hospital. In the last weeks." He stopped. "She said something was wrong, that something felt off, separate from her diagnosis." Edith's expression did not change, but her eyes, those careful, decades-trained eyes, went very still. "I know," she said quietly. Raymond looked at her. "She told me too," Edith said. "I should have." She stopped. "I should have done more with that." The room was silent. "You're doing something with it now," Frank said carefully. Edith looked at Raymond. "I stayed quiet once," she said. "I won't stay quiet again." What followed was not a confrontation. It was a campaign. Raymond Holt had built $3 billion through patience, intelligence, and the absolute refusal to move before the moment was right. He had not survived 4 decades of business by being impulsive. He was not going to be impulsive now. He called, quietly, through channels that bypassed his household communications entirely. A private physician he trusted absolutely. The physician arranged discreet blood work, performed off-site. Raymond submitted to the tests on a Thursday afternoon. He told Vivienne he was at a foundation board meeting. She had smiled and said, "Don't work too hard." Love, and handed him a travel mug of the herbal tea she prepared for him every morning. He had taken it. He had not drunk it. He had taken it to the physician. The results came back in 36 hours. Raymond received them in Frank's office. Not his own, not anywhere that could be monitored. He sat across from the physician, a quiet, precise woman named Dr. Amadarko, and listened as she explained, in careful, measured language, what the analysis had found. There were compounds present in his system and in the tea that should not have been there. Not in dangerous quantities, individually, but combined, sustained, administered consistently over a period of weeks or months. They produced exactly the symptoms Raymond had been experiencing: cognitive fog, fatigue, coordination disruption, and, over time, if sustained long enough, a pattern that could be made to resemble early-stage neurological decline. Raymond sat with this information for a long moment. "Early-stage neurological decline," he repeated. Dr. Darko was very still, which would create grounds, Raymond said slowly, for a competency challenge. Dr. Darko said nothing. She didn't need to. Frank, seated beside Raymond, said quietly, "Raymond, the documents." The 2 documents Raymond had signed, the ones Miles had said Vivienne filed, were retrieved from Frank's backup copies. Raymond read them now with the focused, undrugged attention he had been denied for months. The first document was an amendment to his estate trust, a relatively minor-seeming adjustment to beneficiary language, buried in procedural phrasing that was specifically designed to look like a routine update, that redirected a significant portion of liquid asset authority in the event of Raymond's incapacitation or certified cognitive impairment. The redirected authority went to a named representative. The named representative was Vivienne Carver. The second document was a medical power of attorney, again framed as routine. A document Raymond had been told was simply updating outdated records after his last medical review. In the event of cognitive impairment determined by 2 certifying physicians, Vivienne Carver would have full medical authority, the right to make decisions about Raymond's care, including the right to place him in residential care if deemed necessary. Raymond closed the folder. He sat very still. He thought about the fog, the fatigue, the way his hands had shaken at the gala, the way he'd stood in meetings lately, feeling like a man watching himself from a distance, unable to fully land back in his own mind. He thought about what it would have looked like, in 6 months, in a year, if no one had stopped it. A 64-year-old man in declining cognitive health. 2 legal documents. A fiancé with full authority, a billion-dollar estate. He thought about Margaret. Something is wrong that isn't only medical. He thought about Amara, 8 years old, shaking, whispering, "Please don't drink anything your fiancé gives you tonight." He closed his eyes, and when he opened them, Raymond Holt's face was very calm, very decided. The way it looked, Frank Ossie would tell people years later, right before Raymond did something that changed everything. There was one more layer. Because there is always one more layer when someone has been planning this long and this carefully. Raymond's security team, brought in quietly through a contact that bypassed his household entirely, began running background on Vivienne Carver. What they found, they brought to Raymond in pieces, because that was the only way to absorb it. Vivienne Carver's philanthropic consulting firm, the one she had introduced herself through, the one that had given her legitimate access to Raymond's world, had exactly 3 clients on record. All 3 were older, financially substantial widowers. One had signed away significant asset authority before quietly dying of what was recorded as age-related decline. One was currently contesting legal arrangements in a case that had been sealed. The third was Raymond, and Vivienne's background, carefully obscured, layered with LLCs and intermediary identities, connected eventually to a name. A man named Davis Mercer, who had once worked, briefly and obscurely, at the medical facility where Margaret Holt had received her final care. Davis Mercer, who had left that position under circumstances that no one had ever fully documented. Davis Mercer, who was, the investigation confirmed, Vivienne Carver's former business partner, and the person she had been secretly meeting, twice monthly, in a hotel bar 40 minutes from the city. Raymond received this information on a Tuesday afternoon. He sat in Frank's office and read through everything. He thought about Margaret saying something is wrong. He thought about a woman in a hospital corridor who had no reason to be there. He thought about what it meant, truly meant, if what he was beginning to believe was accurate. He had thought, when this started, that he was dealing with a woman who wanted his money. He understood now that what he might actually be dealing with was something far darker. And he understood, with a cold, clarifying certainty, that whatever he did next had to be done perfectly, because he was only going to get one chance. The Holt Foundation's annual scholarship dinner was held 3 weeks later. It was a smaller event than the gala, perhaps 80 guests, a seated dinner at the Foundation's private event space, an evening designed to honor the young recipients of the Foundation's educational grants. It had been Margaret's favorite event of the Foundation calendar. The gala is for the donors, she used to say. The scholarship dinner is for the people. Raymond had continued it faithfully since her death. This year, he had added something. At the center of the guest list, invited quietly, separately, with personal calls from Raymond himself, were the people who needed to be present. Frank Osei, Dr. Ama Darko, Edith Owusu, Daniel Holt, who had flown in from London without telling anyone except his father. Claire Holt, who had known something was wrong for months and had been waiting, white-knuckled and terrified, for her father to tell her what it was. 2 detectives from the Financial Crimes Unit of the City Police Department, present as guests of the Foundation, their attendance logged nowhere that Vivienne's careful eyes would find. And Vivienne herself, of course, seated at Raymond's right hand, radiant, completely composed, wearing a dress the color of deep water and a diamond pendant that Raymond had given her at Christmas. When he had still been, he understood now, considerably less than himself. Raymond had spent the 3 weeks preparing this evening, behaving as if nothing had changed. This was the hardest thing he had ever done, harder than building the first company, harder than the years of grinding work that had followed, harder in a different way than losing Margaret, because this required him to sit across a dinner table from a woman he now believed may have contributed to his wife's death, and smile, and pour her wine, and say you look beautiful tonight, and watch her smile back at him with the practiced warmth he had once believed in completely. He had done it. He had done it because there was no other way. Because if she suspected, if she had any warning, the legal structure she had put in place was sophisticated enough to create years of challenge. He needed it to happen here, publicly, irrevocably, with witnesses who could not be dismissed. Dinner proceeded smoothly. The scholarship recipients were introduced. A young woman studying environmental law, a young man pursuing medical research, 3 others, each extraordinary in their own quiet way. Raymond spoke briefly, warmly, as he always did at this event, about Margaret, about what she had believed, about what the Foundation existed to do. His voice was steady. His children, seated across the room from him, watched his face. Vivienne placed her hand over his at the table and gave it a squeeze that looked, to anyone watching, like love. Raymond smiled at her. He turned back to the room. "I have one additional item for the evening," he said. His tone was conversational, almost casual. "Before we move to dessert, I want to take a moment for something personal." Vivienne turned her head slightly toward him. Just slightly. Raymond reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small remote. He pressed a button. At the front of the room, a presentation screen descended quietly behind the podium. Over the past several months, Raymond said, still conversationally, I've had reason to look very carefully at certain aspects of my life. Vivienne's hand was still on the table. It had gone very still. I want to share some of what I found, Raymond said. The screen came to life. The first image was a financial document, the estate trust amendment, displayed clearly with the key clauses highlighted. Raymond walked through it quietly, precisely as he might walk through a business proposal. He explained what it said. He explained what it would have meant. He explained that he had no memory of understanding its full implications when he signed it. He explained why. The second slide showed the medical power of attorney. He was equally precise. The third slide showed medical results, his own, with Dr. Darko's annotations. The fourth showed photographs, security footage, the hotel bar 40 minutes from the city, Vivienne and Davis Mercer together across 2 years of bi-monthly meetings. The fifth showed background documentation, the other 2 widowers, the LLC structure, the financial patterns. The sixth showed hospital access records, a visitor log entry, a woman unnamed who had signed in as a medical colleague and accessed the floor where Margaret Holt spent her final weeks. The signed-in name was false. The physical description was in the record. Raymond did not narrate this slide. He let the room read it. The silence in that room was unlike anything Frank Ossie would ever be able to properly describe to anyone who had not been there. Vivienne did not move. She sat with extraordinary composure. Her face had gone to a place that was not quite expressionless. It was something more deliberate than that, more calculated. Raymond turned to look at her. He said, quietly, just to her, but in a room where everyone was listening, Vivienne, I think you should know that the detectives seated at table 4 have been here since the beginning of the evening, and that everything you've just seen has already been provided to the relevant authorities. Vivienne said nothing. Her jaw was very tight. She looked at the screen. She looked at the room. She looked, once, at the door, and then at the 2 plainclothes detectives who had quietly stood from their chairs at table 4. And then, from the back of the room, a small voice. Amara Owusu, seated beside her grandmother, stood up. She was wearing a dress Edith had bought her for the occasion, navy blue, the same shade she had worn to the gala. She looked at Vivienne Carver across the length of the room, 8 years old, perfectly still, and she said, in a voice that was very quiet and very clear, "Did you hurt his first wife too?" The question hung in the air of that room like something physical, like a weight that everyone in the space suddenly felt pressing down on them. Vivienne looked at the child. For the first time all evening, perhaps for the first time in a very long time, something moved behind her eyes that was not calculated, something that might have been fear, or guilt, or the exhaustion of someone who has been holding an enormous secret for a very long time and has just felt the last wall give way. She looked at Amara. She looked at Raymond. She opened her mouth, and then she closed it, and the sound she made, not quite a word, not quite a denial, was enough. It was, in the end, enough. The detectives moved forward. The room, those 80 witnesses, sat absolutely still, and Raymond Holt looked at his daughter across the table and saw Claire's face, the face of a woman who had known something was wrong for months and had been terrified, begin, slowly, to let go of something. He looked at Daniel, who had flown from London, who was gripping the edge of the table with both hands and looking at his father with an expression that Raymond would carry with him for the rest of his life. He looked at Edith Owusu, who had stayed quiet once and had never forgiven herself, who had not stayed quiet again. She met his eyes. She gave him one small, steady nod. The weeks that followed were not easy. Raymond had not expected them to be. The legal process was careful and slow, the way legal processes are. Vivienne's attorney was skilled. There were challenges. There were delays. There were days when the full picture of what had happened, of what might have happened, of what Raymond believed had happened to Margaret, felt too heavy to carry. He carried it anyway, with Frank beside him, with Claire calling every morning, with Daniel, who extended his visit from 1 week to 6, sleeping in his childhood bedroom and appearing in the kitchen every morning to make coffee the way his mother used to, too strong, with exactly 1 spoon of honey. Raymond drank it every day without complaint. It tasted a little bit like being loved. The investigation into Margaret's death was reopened. Raymond could not know, no one could promise him, what it would ultimately find. He had made peace, as much as a person can, with the possibility that some questions don't get the answers they deserve. But he had asked. He had refused to not ask. And Margaret, he felt this privately, without needing to explain it to anyone, would have wanted him to ask. She had always believed that the truth deserved to be looked for, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. Davis Mercer was located within 10 days of the scholarship dinner. He had underestimated, as many people in this story had underestimated, how thorough Raymond Holt could be when he was thinking clearly. The investigation was ongoing. Raymond chose not to speak publicly about the details. He let the process move without his narration. He was, after 40 years of being a man who controlled things, learning, slowly, genuinely, how to let some things be handled by people whose job it was to handle them. Constance, his housekeeper of 19 years, who had stood in a doorway and looked at him with the face of someone watching something happen they couldn't stop, received a very significant bonus that Christmas. Raymond told her when he gave it to her that she had been braver than she knew. Constance had said, with the particular dignity of a woman who has served a household faithfully and watched it survive, "I knew something was wrong, Mr. Holt. I just didn't know how to say it." "You said it," Raymond told her. "In your own way." She had nodded once in that way of hers and gone back to the kitchen, and Raymond had stood in the hallway of his house. His house, which felt lighter now, which felt like his again, and stood still for a moment, just breathing. Edith Owusu received something too. Not money at first, though that came through the foundation, in a form that honored rather than diminished what she had done. What Raymond gave her first was a letter. He wrote it by hand, 4 pages, in his careful architect's handwriting, and he said everything in it that he hadn't been able to say in Frank's office or at the dinner or in the weeks of legal process that followed. He said he was sorry for what she had carried alone. He said that Margaret had been lucky in those final weeks to have someone beside her who listened. He said that he believed, as fully as he had ever believed anything, that staying silent a second time would have destroyed her. He said, "You didn't stay silent." That changed everything. Edith read the letter at her kitchen table. Amara was doing homework across from her. When Edith put the letter down, Amara looked up. "Good news?" she asked. Edith looked at her granddaughter, at those 8-year-old eyes that had looked across a crowded ballroom and found the one person who needed to hear the truth. "Yes," Edith said. "Good news." The following spring, Raymond restructured the Holt Foundation's scholarship program. He added a new award, unnamed publicly, referred to internally only by a small engraved plaque in the Foundation's main conference room. The plaque read, "For courage that costs something." The first recipient was a young woman from the east side of the city who was studying child advocacy law. She had been recommended by her school principal, who described her as someone with an unusual ability to see what others miss and the courage to say so. Raymond met her at the spring dinner. She was 19 years old. She reminded him, in her quietness and her steadiness, of Amara. He told her so. She smiled. And Raymond Holt, for the first time in longer than he could properly measure, smiled back. Not with the careful, managed composure of a man holding himself together, but with something real, something that had earned its way back, something that, after everything, had survived. There is a particular kind of courage that asks nothing in return. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wait for permission. It simply looks at what is happening and refuses to look away. A child understood this instinctively. A retired nurse remembered it after years of having forgotten. And a man who had spent a lifetime building walls learned, finally, to trust the people who were willing to risk something to tell him the truth. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And tell us in the comments, have you ever had someone warn you about a person you trusted? Your story matters. And we'll see you in the next one.